Well, we're back in the garden today in Melbourne, Victoria, and of course the situation isn't looking particularly encouraging for Melbourne at the moment. But today I wanted to talk about the budget deficit for Australia. Back on the 25th of May, we forecast that the deficit for 2019-20 would be $80 billion, and that for 2021 would be $170 billion. They were fairly confronting numbers, given that back in December last year, the government was forecasting surpluses in both years of around $5 billion. So why have we actually increased these numbers even more than the numbers we talked about in May? Well, for a start, we saw the deficit number for May print at $25 billion. And we think that June will print at $30 billion. And that will give you that $95 billion we're talking about for 2019-20. The key part there was that, of course, we have a substantial fiscal stimulus in those numbers, but we also have a substantial deterioration in the so-called cyclical deficit. And that's when the economy contracts, expenditure rises sharply for governments, but taxation receipts fall sharply. We think that was about 2.75% of GDP in 2019-20. So for 2020-21, we think that component of the deficit will jump from 2.75% in 1920 to 5% in 2021. That'll be worth $100 billion on the deficit. There's another $90 billion of government stimulus policies that we already know about, such as improving the cash flow of businesses, the JobKeeper and the JobSeeker packages. But we also expect that there'll be an extension of JobKeeper after September. And our figuring around that is that there are currently 3.3 million workers receiving JobKeeper. The main industries that are in that section are 400,000 for professional services, 385,000 for health, 350,000 for construction, 315,000 for hospitality, 315,000 for retail, and importantly, 135,000 for arts and recreation. That covers about 2 million of the 3.3 million employees that are receiving JobKeeper. So what we expect will happen is that those industries that are going to be affected by the extension of social distancing, by the extension of foreign travel restrictions, will get an extension in JobKeeper. And there'll be other businesses that will be able to demonstrate the conditions on which they originally qualified for JobKeeper and can demonstrate that they're being affected indirectly by these ongoing restrictions. So we think there'll be about 1 million jobs that will retain the JobKeeper benefit for the 3 months after September. And then after that, about 500,000 will continue to get the benefit for the full 6 months. Bear in mind those numbers I mentioned before, 315,000 in hospitality, 125,000 in the arts. We think around 50,000 directly affected by air travel. So I think that hardcore 500,000 will receive JobKeeper going to June next year. That'll cost about $24 billion over the course of the year. We also expect JobSeeker to be adjusted. At $1,150 a fortnight, that's very close to the $1,500 of the minimum wage. And that, of course, creates issues for competitiveness of workers, for incentives of workers. So that number will be adjusted. But I don't think it can go all the way back down to the $620 that we think of in terms of the old unemployment benefits for the fortnight. We're estimating around $850. And if that was to be the case, that would add about $11 billion to the deficit over that period. Finally, on October the 6th, we have a budget. That budget will be stimulatory. I think it'll be stimulatory for about another $15 billion. Now, bear in mind that that increase in jobs that in the unemployment benefits will be a permanent change. I don't think the government will want to introduce any more permanent changes in that budget. So the first thing to do, I think, will be to bring forward the tax cuts that are already legislated to start in July 2022. They cost about $15 billion a year. So I think there'll be $7 billion for the 6 months of the second half of 2021 for that component. And I think there'll be around another $8 billion for infrastructure and some one-off payments. So when we add up all of those components, we get around a $50 billion increase in the deficit for 2021. So if we go back, $100 billion for the cyclical deficit, $90 billion for stimulatory packages that are already in place, and another $50 billion for the extension of JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and the budget that we'll see in October, a total of $240 billion. So what does that mean for our debt position? We're expecting that the debt level, the net debt level will be 37% of GDP. That'll be up from 19% of GDP that we had in June 2019. Now, rating agencies look very closely at net debt levels, but I think it has to be borne in mind that interest rates at the moment for government bonds are less than 1%, and our potential growth rate is around 2.5%. So if we don't significantly add to those debt levels as the economy comes out of this crisis in years to come, then the weight on the economy from this government debt will ease proportionately. So I don't see that as being a major issue. There'll be about $925 billion of bonds on issuance by June next year. And what we also have to bear in mind is that we are not unique in the way we're dealing with this problem. If I look at international agencies such as the OECD, they're generally predicting for developed economies that the blowout in the deficit will be between 15 and 20%. Bear in mind, we're talking about 5% in 1920, 12.7% in 2021, a total of around 17.7%. So our numbers are broadly comparable with the rest of the world, but nevertheless, extraordinarily eye-popping numbers indeed. Thank you very much.